this work of missions. An army of missionaries, one man said, were sent to Italy, Germany, Scotland, England, and especially to France. They went out under the cover of night. They hid in barns and in secret rooms behind chimneys. They met in secluded fields and caves. They gathered, and with Calvin's good counsel by letter, which he often signed with a pseudonym, he didn't even dare let it be known that he was giving advice to these missionaries. There were 1,000 underground churches planted in the country of France by 1560 because, like the Israelites in Egypt, the more they were persecuted, afflicted, the more they multiplied and grew. In 20 years, the number of Reformed churches in France increased by 800. 800 new churches in France by the influence of Calvin and the other reformers. It was dangerous for those missionaries. Many were arrested, sentenced to death, so that the Academy of Geneva, the seminary, became known as Calvin's School of Death. So many men left that seminary to do the work of missions who ended up martyrs that they named his school Calvin's School of Death. And critics say Calvin didn't promote missions because they had one aborted attempt to do missions in Brazil. He was a missionary. He had a heart of a missionary. He was interested in the propagation of the truth. And Calvin's doctrine of predestination and the sovereignty of God were so far from being hindrances to his work of missions that they in fact were what spurred him on, because by election God has a people that must be gathered. And in the sovereign good providence of God, this is the way that he's going to gather them. The foolishness of preaching. So Calvin said to his fellow reformer Bullinger one time, "If I wished to regard my own life or private concerns, I should immediately betake myself elsewhere. But when I consider how very important this corner is for the propagation of the kingdom of Christ, I have good reason to be anxious that it should be carefully watched over." For the propagation of the kingdom of Christ, the propagation of plants, multiplying of plants. For the propagation of the kingdom of Christ, I need to stay here, right here in Geneva, so that men are trained and can go out and be missionaries. And Calvin's motives, among the motives which include obedience to the divine command and the gathering of the church and the glory of God, they include the personal desire welling up within those who've experienced the sovereign grace of God that called them out of darkness into light. They're interested that others, all kinds of others, whoever they may be, have that very same experience as did he. Calvin was a model for Reformed preachers because it is zeal for missions in the heart of a missionary. In the sixth place, Calvin was a preacher. Calvin was an exegetical, doctrinal, polemical, passionate, practical preacher. Calvin was nothing if Calvin was not a preacher. And Calvin is preeminently a model for me as a minister and your ministers, because Calvin was, if he was anything, a preacher. When Calvin died, before he mentioned any of his other writings, he spoke about his sermons. And although this is the area of Reverend Key's speech, I would be remiss in failing to identify what makes Calvin a model for Reformed ministers. I must mention, at least outline, what made Calvin such a great preacher. Calvin knew what fed the flock. He knew what kept the wolves at bay. what ministered to the lambs, what gave muscle to the bones of the warriors and skill to their hands, he knew. It was the preaching of the gospel that he engaged in every day. He preached with the unshakable conviction that the mouth of the minister was the mouth of God. And the confession that Bullinger wrote reflected the thought and belief of Calvin when it said the preaching of the Word of God is the Word of God. And Calvin believed that when he said in one of his commentaries, wherever the gospel is preached, it is as if God himself came in the midst of us. So besides preaching so many times a week, he lectured to seminary students to train them to be pastors so that he could be sure that when he was gone, there would be others who would be able to train faithful young men. Because it pleases God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe.